Okay, I'm going to talk about practical implementation of green infrastructure strategies. I am John Gulliver, Professor Emeritus at the Department of Civil, Environmental, and Geo Engineering at the University of Minnesota. First, I'd like to apologize for the picture. That picture is me 10 years ago. I was a little bit heavier and about 10 years younger. The agenda. First, I'd like to do go over some background. The impact of runoff from impervious surfaces. Runoff from impervious surfaces is really most of what we see in urban stormwater. Then I'd like to talk about the evolution of stormwater terminology because it's not the same around the world. It varies around the world. So we need to talk about that just very briefly. I'd like to talk about the green to gray infrastructure continuum. What happens when you move from green infrastructure to gray infrastructure and what's in between? Finally, I'd like to move on to some of the benefits, challenges, and solutions of infiltration practices, filtration practices, and then the benefits, challenges, and risk factors of pond storage. We don't have any solutions yet. I have some concepts about possible solutions. And then some take-home messages. So the impact of impervious runoff. Well, most urban runoff comes from impervious surfaces. If you look at a typical water budget, this is something published by Chris May at the University of Washington. And you move from forested land cover to urbanized land cover. In forested land cover, you have different percentages: evaporation, transpiration, interflow, which is kind of a groundwater flow that is fairly close to the surface, groundwater, you can replenish the groundwater, and surface runoff. In forested land cover, you only have 0.3% on average of the rainfall ends up as surface runoff. In an urbanized land cover, that is 30%. So you're generating roughly 100 times more runoff. And that has implications. So if we look at this in terms of a typical hydrograph, this would be a hydrograph for a large storm. After development of an urban area, you have a large peak at the beginning, a quick peak, a large volume of runoff. This is runoff versus time. If before development, you had a fairly small peak, a later peak, and a slow decay. So we have a lot of water to deal with. In addition, the surface runoff contains wash-off pollutants. The rain isn't that dirty when it falls. There are some chemicals absorbed from the atmosphere, but there are wash-off pollutants that occur. Nutrients from leaves, grass clippings, tree flowers, etc. The cars driving on the roads all have metals, which they lose. When you hit your brakes, you lose a little bit of copper every time you hit your brakes. When you run your tires over the road, you lose zinc, and you lose, as your tires wear, and you lose copper. The chromium is on the cars. It comes off, and lead is a legacy pollutant. It's in the soil. It gets on the streets, and we wash it off. And so there is problems with water quality in impervious runoff. You also have petroleum hydrocarbons. So one example here would be cyanobacteria, which is the cause of harmful algal blooms. Harmful algal blooms can kill your fish, can make your dog sick, even kill your dog, and can give you a pond, a lake, a river that looks really ugly. It's not attractive. So there are problems with nutrients and metals, pollutants in urban runoff. Another impact of impervious runoff is all of this flow creates problems. When you have less than 5% impervious area, you have a pretty natural stream. When you go up to 8 to 10%, this stream here starts to look like this. When you go up to 30%, then you start having bank erosion, and your stream starts to look like this here. And so then you have to get in and you have to make some changes to protect the banks, to do things so that it doesn't meander too much, things like that. And it becomes effort. You have to work at it. Finally, There's the impact of combined sewer overflows. Most cities were built over 100 years ago have combined sewers. That means you have sanitary sewer and that has waste, human waste, and storm sewer together in one pipe. When it rains, the runoff from the streets and the parking lots and the houses comes so quickly that the system cannot handle that. So you have backup. It backs up into your basements. It backs up into the streets. This is combined sewer overflow. You can see some of the trash here, which is not the type of trash that you get with surface runoff. This is the type of trash trash that you have with combined sewers. So you have combined sewer flowing over into the streets, into basements, underground structures. That is not a good thing for human health. The final impact, we're talking 5 impacts now of impervious runoff. The final impact is flooding during extreme events. You saw that large peak that happened all at once. Well, that large peak has implications. The implications you can see right here. Flooding, one heck of a flood sometimes. So there are 5 general impacts of impervious runoff that we need to take care of. So I'd like to shift a little bit and go to the evolution of stormwater technology. The reason is that every region has its own terminology. These are not exactly equivalent, but they're pretty close. So in the United Kingdom, they have sustainable urban drainage systems, and these are stormwater systems that drain the water and do it sustainably. So that would be infiltration basins, filtration basins, ponds, all these things are sustainable urban drainage systems. In Australia, they developed a term for a similar type item, but they call it water sensitive urban systems, or WSUD. In France, they call these alternative techniques. In China, they call them sponge cities. Sponge cities is primarily about infiltration practices, which is similar to low impact development in the United States. Now in the United States, we can't have one term. We have 5 terms in the United States. We started off with stormwater best management practices, or BMPs. That's all infrastructure used to treat quantity and quality of stormwater. Now, the problem with BMPs is that it is a management term. It's not a stormwater term. It's not an engineering term. It's a management term. So there are lots of BMPs in the world because management of the world economy is basically how the economy runs. So they developed low impact development, which is primarily evapotranspiration and infiltration, similar to sponge cities. In 2008, the National Research Council got together and said, well, BMPs isn't that good of a term. So they started calling it stormwater control measures, or SCMs. Now, most academics are now calling it SCMs, but most practitioners are still talking about BMPs. So we have a dichotomy of expressions. And then in 2012, the US EPA kind of seized on the term green infrastructure, and they called it, and they related it to stormwater. So green infrastructure was originally related to stormwater, but it's become an ecological framework for social, economic, and environmental health. So it's kind of a broad term. So we are starting to talk about green stormwater infrastructure. And that's what I'll be talking about. That will be stormwater infrastructure that relates to social, economic, and environmental health. So I'd like to continue with the background, and this is the green to gray continuum in stormwater infrastructure. A student of mine, Vinny Taguchi, and I sat down and thought about what's green, what's gray, and what's in between. So we looked at the 2 limits. Green infrastructure would be natural areas, forests, woods, wetlands, prairies. These are natural areas, and that would be considered to be the most green. Gray infrastructures are conventional drainage. That's on the far right. Gray infrastructure would be underground sewers. In this case, storm sewers. In between, we have the green to gray infrastructure. What is of our green infrastructure, what is the most green? Well, we thought about it and we decided, well, that would be ponds and wetlands. The reason that ponds and wetlands are the most green is because they provide service to the runoff. They store the runoff, they treat the runoff, but also they provide habitat. A pond and a wetland will provide habitat for waterfowl, provide habitat for terrestrial animals like deer, muskrats, these types of things. And so we call that the most green stormwater infrastructure. Next comes rain gardens. Rain gardens are not as green because they're too small. They're too small to support deer, too small to support foxes. But they are large enough. They have large, fairly tall plants, and they can support insects. They can support pollinators. They can support bees, these types of things. So we call that actually our next line of green infrastructure. Finally, we have filtration, and then we have filtration and infiltration basins. These are normally considered to be the most green because they're doing good things with regard to stormwater. But we call these the third most green because they really don't have an infrastructure that provides habitat. They're typically mowed. They're grassed and they are mowed. And these practices are just not that much help for the habitat. The fourth would be temporary flood storage, which is like a infiltration basin, except you're not infiltrating or filtering. You're just storing. So temporary flood storage would be look like an infiltration basin, but it's just storing water and then letting it out slowly. So it's doing less than an infiltration basin. And then on the far right, we have underground storage. Underground storage would be underground stormwater BMPs or SCMs, potentially storing water, infiltrating water. Permeable pavement would be underground storage because you're infiltrating the water into an underground area. So that would be the far right. And then finally, we have conventional storage. So that's the green to gray infrastructure continuum that we have developed for stormwater. So I would like to move on to the benefits, challenges, and solutions. First of infiltration, then of filtration, and finally we'll talk about benefits, challenges, and risk factors of pond storage. We don't have any solutions as of yet. I'd like to finish with some take-home messages. So what are the benefits of infiltration? Well, infiltration is where you take the water and you put it into the soil, just like it was in nature. So you're getting back towards the runoff, the hydrograph of your previous undeveloped state, the woods, the forest, the prairies. You're trying to get back to that. So you have volume reduction. That's a high percentage of the design storms, and smaller can be infiltrated. You have reduced peak flow. You have filtration through the soil. The soil will filter a lot of solid. They'll filter most of the solids, a lot of the dissolved contaminants as well. You have temperature control because you're recharging your groundwater and your interflow is much slower. So that means that you have temperature control, and that's important for trout streams. And then finally, you have an increase of base flow, not of the flood flow in streams, not of the peak flow in streams, but of the base flow. In some streams these days in urban systems, we have streams that go dry in the summer because we don't have any groundwater flow anymore. We don't have any base flow anymore. And that's a stream that is not a habitat for things like fish, clams. And so we need to get some base flow back into those streams. Infiltration will help that. So infiltration practices are generally recommended when reasonable. Reasonable means, can you infiltrate? So here's our graph of runoff versus time again. We have a post-development curve. We have a pre-development curve down here in green. If you install intensive detention, that would be detention basins, ponds, things like that, you could bring your peak down here, but you don't change the volume. So the volume is still large. You still have all the problems that volume brings. You don't have as much flow during the peak, but you do have, and this is a lot of detention. If you do intensive infiltration, you can approach your pre-development hydrograph. So that's the goal. Infiltration practices are many. They look like this. There's an infiltration basin here. Here's an underground infiltration chambers, some rain gardens or bioinfiltration practices, swales, and there are also filter strips, tree trenches, and permeable pavement. But there are challenges, and I'm talking about challenges. Here's a challenge to infiltration. Well, one challenge to infiltration I'm not really mentioning here is that you can't infiltrate every place. There are places where you have wellhead protection. If you are in a location where you have polluted ground, you can infiltrate there typically because you don't want to pollute the groundwater. But one big challenge to infiltration is if you're in an area where you have salt added to the roads during the winter. So this is a salt sprayer, sprays salt on the road. There's a lot of water going onto that road from the salt sprayer. This salt applier. It's 30% salt by volume. 30% sodium chloride is right here coming onto the road. That amount of salt on the road has an impact. Even though chloride is not that bad, that amount of anything can have an impact. And so here's what happens in the Twin Cities, the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. We have impaired waters. There's the red streams and the red dots for lakes and the red streams. These are all impaired from chloride. And chloride is of greatest use in the center of the city where you have the most developed area. And you can see the center of the city right here. Now, right here this is St. Paul right here. This is Minneapolis right here. In the center of the city is where you have the most problems with chloride pollution. There's also the possibility that nitrates will get through. Nitrate is not that significant in urban runoff. It is much more significant in the runoff from agriculture. Another challenge to infiltration is that they don't always work. From day zero, about 30% of infiltration practices worldwide fail to function. The reason is because of the high spatial variability in infiltration. If you move a distance of about 1 meter, you can get a factor of 100 difference in your infiltration ability. So if you take one measurement of infiltration or one soil core, it tells you virtually nothing about the ability of a practice to infiltrate water. So what we need is a lot of measurements. We need expertise in soil profiling. It's not easy to design an infiltration basin because you need to be a soil profiler and you need to have a lot of measurements. And then you need some statistics to make sense of those measurements. And you also need a different kind of excavation and grading. You can't just build an infiltration basin like you would a parking lot. One good way to decrease the infiltration significantly in an infiltration basin is to run a tractor over it with a front end loader, carrying some soil. So these are some 3 practices that have really failed. This obviously has failed. This is after rainstorm. It's been there for longer than 48 to 72 hours. It's been there a long time. And the water is a rain garden with water sitting in it, no plants growing. And you also have deposition of fine silts and things like that that can stop infiltration. And then you have this practice over here. This is an infiltration basin. We showed up in the fall when it hadn't rained in a while, but we were looking at the infiltration basin. We were saying, well, why is there no grass in the center of the infiltration basin? Well, there's no grass in the center of the infiltration basin because it was full of water at some time for longer than 72 hours. Longer than 3 days, it was full of water. That means it was not infiltrating quickly enough. The plants didn't grow. It killed all the plants. So if you have a good infiltrating basin, you probably have plants in that basin. I'm going to talk more about plants. And the other challenge to infiltration is the clogging of pores. It's important when plants are not present. The plants will keep the pores open. Why do they keep the pores open? They'll keep the soil porous. They keep the soil porous because the roots need water. Of course, they're going to keep it porous. They've evolved that way. The plants that did not keep the pores open, they died. The plants that keep the pores open, they lived, and they're here now. That's why plants work well for keeping pores open, for allowing a lot of infiltration. But when you don't have plants present, like permeable pavement or underground infiltration chambers, then you have to worry about the clogging of pores. So a partial solution to the failure to infiltrate that we developed is the attacks the spatial variability in infiltration rates. We developed a modified Philip Dunn infiltrometer. You can take multiple measurements very easily to characterize the infiltration rate of a practice, a rain garden, bio-infiltration facility, infiltration trench, whatever. Now you need 10 measurements to get within a factor of 3. This is true of everything that we've looked at. You need 10 measurements to get within a factor of 3 of your infiltration rate. You need 20 measurements to get within a factor of 2. That's a lot of measurements. So we developed the Philip Dunn Infiltrometer 2007. It's easy to install. Here it is here. It's relatively quick. It's a falling head infiltrometer, so it requires less water. This is licensed to a local manufacturer. And they have a very nice looking one. We use ones we manufacture ourselves. They don't look quite as nice as this. It comes with a bunch of stuff to install it. So this is about the variation in infiltration rates. Here's a saturated hydraulic conductivity, which is here's a saturated hydraulic conductivity, which varies by a factor of 100. The blue dots are a factor of 100 larger than the red dots. And if you look at some spots in this rain garden, this is a rain garden. We took 40 measurements in this rain garden. You can go from one spot here to here. You have a factor of 100 difference. That's like 2 meters apart. Up here, the same thing happens. You go here, you have a factor of 100 difference right there. That's 2 meters apart. In some cases, we found that 1 meter apart, you can find a factor of 100. So it makes a heck of a difference, and you have to take lots of measurements. You have to calculate the mean, calculate the median, and do the geometric mean. The geometric mean and the geometric median will tell you, the geometric mean and the arithmetic mean between them will tell you how quickly the practice will infiltrate water. So we used these devices to look at infiltration in drainage ditches, grass drainage ditches, which are basically grass swales. There's really no difference between them. A drainage ditch, if it's growing grass, it'll infiltrate water. And so we installed a bunch of these in here and measured infiltration rates. We found that these drainage ditches, or these swales, were very successful at infiltrating water, except where you have high groundwater. Well, when you have high groundwater, it's difficult to infiltrate into the ground to empty the swale, just because the groundwater will hold you back. But the main reason is that you have plants. They keep the pores open. And the plants require minimal maintenance. You have to mow it, and you have to clean up the trash. That's all you have to do. And you can go away and you can leave your swales, you can leave your infiltration basins, just mow it every now and then and clean up the trash. You don't have to do any other messing around with it. Here in this swale, we measured 104 infiltration measurements. And this was a research project. We measured 104 infiltration measurements in a day and a half. Here we took 10 infiltration measurements in a very small section to determine what happens in this small section. So here's an example of swales and the influence of plants. We have 4 swales next to different highways. Here we did, what we did is we measured the soil texture. We took a soil core. We looked at the soil texture. We have a loam and a sandy loam, a loamy sand and a sandy loam, a loamy sand and a sandy clay loam. Now, usually you take and then there's something called the hydrologic soil group based upon the soil texture. The hydrologic soil group tells you if you have A soil, B soil, C soils, or D soils. The A has really good infiltration, that'd be the sand. The D has very poor infiltration, those would be the clays. And B and C are somewhere in between. Based upon the soils, we should have, in this case, we had a hydrologic soil group based on soil texture of B, not A, of B. We had 2 A soil textures and a C soil texture down here. When we measured the saturated hydraulic conductivity, we took a lot of measurements. We measured how well the infiltration for the practice would be. We got fairly high infiltration rates. These are centimeters per hour. This is the saturated hydraulic conductivity, which tells you the most important parameter in infiltration. Anyway, we had 3.5 centimeters per hour, 5.7, 4.1. These are all A soils based upon the KSAT. We had 4 A soils, even though we should have had, based upon the soil texture, a B soil and a C soil. So these 4 A soils are the influence of the plants. And the porosity also tells you something about the influence of the plants. These are really high porosities. If you have a sand, it's difficult to get above just sand without soil. It's difficult to get above, just sand without plants. It's difficult to get above 40% porosity. 45%, 50 is really not unheard of. But our porosity was 56, 54, 58%. The plants keep the soil open, let the water infiltrate. So that's the benefits of infiltration practices. There are many benefits. The problem is that 30% of our infiltration practices, we build them, and 30% of them do not function from day one. That's a big problem. We need to take care of that problem. We need to get better at building infiltration practices. So let's talk about the benefits of filtration practices. There are fewer benefits of filtration practices, but filtration practices filter water by improving the water quality. And improve the water quality by filtering particles. Some of the challenge, well, one challenge is it doesn't have the multiple benefits of infiltration. It does not have it only has a small reduction in peak flow. It has no volume reduction. It has minimal temperature control, and the base flow in streams does not increase. So filtration practices, these filtration practices are ones where you filter the water, but you don't infiltrate it into the soil. You filter the water at a location where you cannot infiltrate because of wellhead protection or really tight soils. And so then you filter it and then put it back into the storm sewer or into your receiving water body. And one problem is that filtration does not remove dissolved contaminants like phosphate. And these are roughly 45% of the pollutants are dissolved. The metals, the phosphorus, the nitrogen, 45% of the pollutants are, roughly 45% are dissolved. Phosphate, for example, is a primary cause of harmful algal blooms and eutrophication. So it's something that we want to deal with. So this is a partial solution to the phosphate retention problem. We developed an iron-enhanced sand filter to remove the phosphate in addition to the particles. And this is the dissolved phosphate in the flow. Phosphate is the primary form of the dissolved phosphorus in the flow. So we put in 5 to 10% iron filings, 95 to 90% sand. The iron filings will oxidize, they'll basically rust, and then they'll capture the phosphate after they rust. And a retention of 70 to 90% of the phosphate when designed and maintained properly is possible and actually feasible. So this is what one looks like. This is a filtration basin. It's filled with water. It goes down through the iron enhanced sand into a drain tile and out into the storm sewer or the receiving water body. We also have developed a compost amended sand to grow plants. The iron enhanced sand doesn't grow plants very well because the iron grabs all the phosphorus, and plants need phosphorus to grow. So it doesn't grow plants very well. But if you put compost amended sand on top of the iron enhanced sand, it will grow the plants. The problem is that compost releases phosphorus because it's decaying natural organic material. So it releases phosphorus. So the iron enhanced sand underneath it will capture the phosphorus released by the compost and the phosphorus in the water coming in to the rain garden. And then you have a gravel subbase and underdrain. It goes into the underdrain and out, similar to what we have above. So that's our partial solution to the filtration problem and phosphorus retention. It's very important if you have a freshwater body downstream. And that would be like lakes, rivers, streams, and the upper part of an estuary are all phosphorus limited in growth. So example, iron enhanced sand filtrations application, it would be on the right, we have a basin. You can see the basin is about 8 foot tall. This is the iron enhanced sand right here with some pea gravel on top of it. And this is just a aesthetic effect. I call it the Stonehenge effect. On the right, on the left, we have a pond with an iron enhanced sand filter around it. When the pond fills up because of a storm, the water runs over the iron enhanced sand filter and leaves through the iron enhanced sand filter into the receiving water body or into the storm sewer. 2 applications of iron enhanced sand filtration. There are 170 iron enhanced sand filtrations installed in the upper Midwest, and we feel very grateful for that. We feel that they are a good practice that will be moving throughout the world. So let's move on to talk about stormwater ponds. Stormwater ponds are very successful in that they settle particulates and associated pollutants. They also convert dissolved phosphorus and dissolved nitrogen to particulate phosphorus and particulate nitrogen because the algae grows in the ponds. So dissolved phosphorus comes in as dissolved phosphorus. The algae grab it and suddenly turn it into particulate phosphorus. They turn it into organic phosphorus. And they provide a wildlife habitat, and they are seen as an amenity in many urban neighborhoods. There are challenges. These ponds have been around for 30 or 40 years. They really haven't been maintained. People pick up the trash. They mow the grass sometimes around the outside, sometimes not. They need maintenance. They really haven't had maintenance with regard to their water quality purpose. And they're also expensive to dredge. Here are some ponds that we've been working on. Some are clean. Some look pretty like there's kind of a lot of pollution in them. Some are somewhere in between. So a group came to see me, the Riley Purgatory Bluff Creek Watershed District, about their phosphorus that they were measuring in their ponds. The phosphorus they were measuring in their ponds was some cases low and in some cases very high. This is total phosphorus here. That's the combination of particulate and dissolved phosphorus. And on the x-axis, we have our 98 ponds. They measured phosphorus concentration in 98 ponds, and some ponds had really high phosphorus concentration. This one has a medium value of 6 milligrams per liter, 6 parts per million, which is really high for phosphorus. And then these over here had, 0.06. So that's a factor of 100 difference between the ponds that were treating phosphorus and the ponds that didn't seem to be doing that well. Now, a pond should have lower phosphorus than what comes into it because what comes in typically settles, right? It settles in the pond, and so you have a phosphate concentration in the pond that's lower than the water coming in. We didn't think that this water coming in had 6 milligrams per liter. So let's take a look. And here's what we found. The red line here is the upper 97.5%. That means that not only 2.5% of the phosphorus coming in is above this point. This is the 97.5% of stormwater concentrations. So that means that these ponds over here are not processing for phosphorus the way they should be. They're actually a source of phosphorus. So we started taking a look at it, and we discovered some things. The first thing we discovered is that ponds are highly stratified. They stratify at 30 centimeters of depth, not like a lake. A lake stratifies at 3 to 5 meters of depth, even a small lake. A large lake, it would be 10 meters of depth. Ponds are stratified at 30 centimeters of depth. That's phenomenal. And it is something that we never planned when we first started building ponds. They were saying, well, ponds are going to be well mixed because they're shallow. They're typically 1 meter to 2 meters deep. But they're stratified at 30 centimeters of depth. So that means they're highly stratified. The top of the pond is exposed to the atmosphere, which has all the oxygen. The bottom of the pond is exposed to the sediments, which have a tremendous oxygen demand. And the reason they have a tremendous oxygen demand is because of all the material that has settled over the years, settled down to the bottom of that pond, and now is demanding oxygen to degrade it. The bacteria down there are demanding oxygen. So there's a tremendous sediment oxygen demand in the bottom of the pond, and the pond is losing oxygen very quickly until you have virtually zero oxygen in the bottom of that pond. So the top has oxygen in it, the bottom does not have oxygen in it. You have a low oxygen system. Low oxygen systems results in sediment phosphate release. So the phosphate that's stored in those sediments, that's buried in those sediments, is being released back into the pond. That's why these ponds have high phosphate and phosphorus concentrations. So we took some sediment cores. Here are some sediment cores. We took a lot of sediment cores. 20 ponds, 25 ponds, 6 cores, 5 to 6 cores per pond. That's a lot of sediment cores. We determined the phosphorus release from these sediments under anaerobic, low dissolved oxygen conditions, anaerobic, high dissolved oxygen conditions. We measured various parameters in the ponds. Here's our measurement system. And we would go out and measure the phosphate concentration and the total phosphorus concentration in the pond. And we had many ponds that we looked at. These ponds are look pretty dirty. They're highly eutrophic, and these ponds are not that dirty, not that eutrophic, with support from a lot of places. And the problem is that once you get stratification, a pond becomes a very small lake. And the processes of phosphorus retention and retention of all nutrients are very complex. They're more complex in a pond than they are in a lake, because a pond is in the total sheltered zone. It's totally in the sheltered zone of the banks. You have a tree canopy, you might have some banks on the side. They'll shelter the pond, so you don't really know what the wind impact is on mixing. The other thing is you have a watershed inputs. They're pretty important, inputs coming in from the watershed. You have aquatic vegetation growing on the pond. You have internal processes, that's mixing, aeration, stratification, sediment characteristics, a highly organic sediment that has a huge sediment oxygen demand. You can have groundwater inflow, which can be significant into these ponds. You have a tree canopy. You have internal loading. The DO goes down, soluble P may go up. So these are fairly complex systems. So we started looking at it. We've been looking at it for a while. And what we found was that mixing, of course, is very dependent upon what's around the outside of the pond. Here's one pond here. It's got duckweed and wolfia in it, covering the surface. And it's totally covered by fairly tall trees, 30-foot tall trees. The wind doesn't get down to a pond like that. The wind at the pond surface is a factor of 100 below the wind at the tree surface. It's just not going to happen. You're not going to get that pond mixed. versus something like this. This is what the pond might have looked at like when it was first built. There's some grass around the outside. There are no trees. The wind can get to it. The wind can mix it. The trees have developed over the 30 to 40 years the pond has been there. So the pond is now stratified where previously it wasn't stratified. When it's stratified, it grows surface algae, surface plants like duckweed, like wolfia. Duckweed is called officially lemna. So it has lemna and wolfia in there. They keep the surface from mixing in addition to the trees. And so we did a study with the topography, canopy height, the canopy extent, and we got a wind mixing frequency versus canopy height. We found a relationship between them. When you have a larger canopy height, you have a lower wind mixing frequency. So there is a relationship here. There are lots of other factors, and that's why the R squared is so low, but this is generally overall a significant finding. We also documented phosphate release due to low DO near the bottom. We took some sediment cores out of the lake. We took some water out of the lake with the sediment cores. We put them in the lab. We allowed them to release, to allow the dissolved oxygen to go towards zero. And we measured the phosphate release from the bottom. We found that some ponds did not have very high phosphorus release. And those are the ponds that were mixed most of the time, but some ponds did have high phosphorus release. So the question is what to do about it, what to do about these ponds. Well, there are some things that we've been thinking about. The first two would be to stop phosphorus release, to not deal with mixing, to not deal with the stratification. We'll have the stratification and just stop the phosphorus release. And that would be with, you can treat it with alum like you do for lakes. You treat them with alum to stop phosphorus release. We can also treat them with iron filings. These are things that need research because they really haven't been done in ponds. The third item is to increase pond mixing. You can increase pond mixing by doing things like cutting down the trees. That would increase pond mixing, or you could aerate the bottom with an aerator and primarily designed to increase the mixing, not to actually add oxygen to the water. And then there's low level withdrawal where you pull the water out of the bottom before it reaches low dissolved oxygen concentrations instead of the top. And finally, there's dredging. All of these need research. We don't really know what impact dredging has on water quality, because dredging doesn't really get down to the pre-pond soil. It leaves about this much soil on the bottom. You can't get down there. And so what is that soil that you left, what is that muck that you left on the bottom, what does that do? It's still mucky, it's still decaying leaves, decaying grass clippings. They're still there. So alum treatments. This is what alum treatments look like in a lake here. Here's what it looks like in a little pond. They have this little device here on a raft, and they're releasing alum in the pond. Iron filing treatments. These look something like this. You have iron filings come through here. They hit a spreader and they're sprayed over the pond. This is an agricultural spreader. Enhanced pond mixing. You can do it with diffusers. Here is a diagram of a diffuser, and you can see what the diffuser does is it mixes in the middle, not necessarily the edges. The reason is these ponds are so shallow, 1 meter to 2 meters deep. It's hard to get to have one mixer mix the entire pond. For example, you might end up with something like this. This is a fountain in the middle of the pond. It's only mixing a small portion of the pond. In this pond, if you're going to mix it, you need 10 of these. So you have to think about that when you cost these out. One of these is not going to do it. One of these pond fountains or underwater mixers. The other item that is about mixing is wind mixing. Now, we had an idea that you could expose the surface to wind mixing by cutting down some of the trees, not all the trees. You cut some pathways through that could create some mixing. In addition, what you could do in these pathways, you could put pollinator habitat, some small bushes, some smaller lower plants, so that you can pollinate. The bees could be there, butterflies could be there, that type of thing. You have a more of an environment where many things could grow, many things could live. That's the idea. The fourth idea is low level withdrawal. That is, you withdraw the cold water off the bottom and bring the warm oxygen enhanced water from the surface down to the bottom. I don't know if that would work because it only rains a certain percentage of the time, but that is a possibility for some ponds. And the fifth option is to investigate what happens when you dredge a pond. Do you make it so that the pond does not release phosphorus? No one knows. No one has really looked into this. Dredging is usually done to free up the pond when it's impeding inflow into the pond. That's really when it's done. It's not done to take care of phosphorus release from the bottom sediments. We need to investigate how well dredging will take care of bottom release of pond phosphorus. So I have some take-home messages. The first is that infiltration has many benefits. I'm a big advocate for infiltration when you can infiltrate. And you can infiltrate in many sea soils because of the plants. And so it's not, when you get a sea soil, that was one of the soils that we had in our study on swales. When you get a sea soil, just see if it'll infiltrate something. If it won't infiltrate something, if you put an underdrain in it, you cap the underdrain, and then when it does not infiltrate very well, you just let the underdrain, open the underdrain up and let it go into the storm sewer. That's how to deal with infiltration when you can. Infiltration has many benefits. Volume reduction, a high percentage of the storm and smaller can be infiltrated, reduce peak flow, infiltration through the soil, and you filter solids, bacteria, nutrients in the soil. Temperature control through groundwater recharge, which is important for trout streams, and increase the base flow in streams. These are all big advantages to infiltration. The challenges are you can pollute the groundwater, especially if you're in a region where you're putting chloride on the ground, onto the streets, parking lots. And the failure to infiltrate is a big challenge. Need to know something about the soil. And plants will help for infiltration. Another take-home message is that filtration is very good at retaining particles. It does not have the numerous advantages of infiltration, but you need to help prevent clogging, you need to reduce clogging, and you need to retain dissolved contaminants, and things like iron filings can help you do that. Third take-home message is that we need to look after our stormwater ponds. We've ignored our stormwater ponds for too long. Many are stratified and releasing phosphate back into the water column, back into the receiving water body. Wind sheltering will result in more stratified days, and the solutions are currently being researched, but these systems are complex. So the solutions will take time and effort, and we may have a different solution for different ponds. So that's my presentation. I'm able to answer any questions. My email address is given here. If you want to contact me with a question or whatever, that's fine. And you can also look up stormwater.safl.umn.edu to see our research program and what we are doing with regard to stormwater runoff and stormwater treatment.